Hello everyone, welcome to the latest tea break. This is the October edition. I'm Oliver Mantell, Director of Evidence and Insight at the Audience Agency, and so I'll be talking for a little bit of the session. And for purposes of audio description, I am we'll call it middle-aged, blonde white male, and we'll also be hearing from, in fact, mainly be hearing from my colleague Elise Boileau, who's our senior researcher at the Evidence team, who's, I think, there on camera. If you want to...
Hello. Yes, for purpose of audio description, I'm a white woman in my late 20s and standing in front of a lovely cheese plant.
Oh, very nice. Just had to rub it in with the late 20s there, didn't we?
Yeah.
But also we'll be hearing from one of our consultancy team, Jacqui. Do you want us to do a quick hello as well?
Hi, yes, I'm Jacqui, and for the purposes of audio description, I'm a white woman. I'm in my 50s and I have purplish hair and glasses.
Lovely, perfect, good description. So yes, so we're going to be saying a bit about the cost of living, which always sounds to me like it should be like a 1980s poetry collection title, you know, some sort of slightly gritty kind of thing, which I guess we're finding ourselves back there again. So we're talking about the cost of living, which we know is something of a hot topic, and what we found so far from the Cultural Participation Monitor about this topic. So for those who haven't heard us talking about it before, the Cultural Participation Monitor is a nationally representative survey of the population that we've been carrying out in multiple waves. And this latest wave is looking at late August, early September. And one of the topics, amongst others, more being shared next Friday in the overall key findings, but one of the topics was looking at the cost of living and people's attitudes and responses to that. Now, clearly, it's been something of a roller coaster ride, shall we say, in terms of the cost of living and its implications and how it's playing out over the last month or so. So this was a snapshot from that point in early, as I say, early September. But it already shows us quite an interesting picture in terms of how different groups are reacting to it. So, so that's what we'll be talking about in terms of today's session. And in absolutely kind of broad outline, I'm going to tell you the overall picture, and then Elise is going to tell you it's more complicated than that, which is, you know, the kind of classic kind of research outline, really. So in terms of the broad picture, as the old joke says of you know, a city slicker asking directions to the city of a farmer, well, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. And in terms of the cost of living, you know, we'd very much rather not be starting from where we are in terms of the pandemic. So we know, as it shows here, most of the population are feeling worse off than they were pre-COVID. There's a lot of variation, but generally speaking, apart from retirees, who a majority of them are essentially sort of as they were because they have a sort of fixed income, for lots of groups they felt worse off, and we know also, as you probably heard us talking about before, that effect is very unequally distributed. So broadly speaking, COVID was hardest on those who could least afford it to be hardest on them. There's sort of general top line. So if that's where we start, that then brings us into the cost of living as a sort of quite a sort of challenging starting picture. And so I guess there's a couple of key, if probably pretty obvious things to say right at the outset. So the first one is that, yes, almost everybody is worried about it. So here we've got this figure along the top, you know, sort of 81% of people saying they're worried about the effects of the cost of living crisis on their household. So it's really widespread. We're not just talking about something that's just affecting particular pockets of the population. And indeed, most of those people are saying that they strongly agree with that statement. So it really is kind of high salience as an issue. And it's not just that people are worried about it, they genuinely think they're going to do things differently in response to it. They're going to cut back their spending, and we'll look in a sec about quite how they're going to do that and what the implications of that might mean. But at a headline level, it's worth saying that entertainment and leisure are, if you like, right in the firing line of where those reductions of spending are likely to happen. It's areas which are, if you like, discretionary spend, and sure enough, a large majority of people are saying they're going to cut back their spending in that broad area. Of course, that could be lots of different things. It could be going to restaurants, it could be sort of going for nights out, but equally it's going to be sort of arts and culture as well. What I think is potentially quite interesting about this, though, is that in some ways it's compounding other trends we've seen from the participation monitor, in that we've seen that in general, post-COVID, people are looking to stay more local in terms of cultural engagement. And the cost of living, if you like, is compounding that and potentially entrenching that as a kind of set of behaviours. So, there's, and people are sort of thinking, well, actually, if fuel is costing that much, then maybe we'll stay more local. Now, the full version of this question was slightly longer and did include because of the cost of travel. And as a result, free options become more attractive to more people. We've seen where we've looked at where would you save money, that in general people have said, well, we'll cut down frequency more than we cut down cost. But here we're seeing, as cost of living bites, people are saying, well, actually, we're going to look at the free stuff as well. So, as a broad picture, essentially, it's really widespread. It's going to affect spending. It's going to affect spending specifically on, if you like, the sectors that we're immediately concerned with. Hopefully, there's going to be some news at some point in this conversation, but this is not it yet. Elise, can you move us on to the next bit? So if we look at those people who are saying they're looking to decrease spending, there are very high proportions of people looking to not just kind of trim that spending, but really kind of lots of them are saying they're going to decrease it a lot, getting off a third of the population. A similar proportion saying they'll decrease it a little. So essentially, it's very, very widespread as a question. Now, we did ask people initially who had that question, are you looking to decrease your spending overall? And as you saw, most people said yes, some didn't. We're going to remember them as a little special group in a second. But across everyone else who said, yes, we're going to look to reduce spending, we gave them a whole list of possible areas and said, so is this an area you're looking to decrease spending? So no, yes, a little, or yes, a lot. And what we saw at a headline level, so before Elise says it's more complicated than that, which it is, but at a headline level, what we saw was across most of these areas, huge proportions of people are looking to reduce them to at least to some extent. So particularly stuff like shopping for non-essentials, which is, I guess, would be the obvious place you'd look for kind of cuts in spending. But really high proportion of people saying, well, they would at least cut all of these areas a bit. When we start to look at the balance within that, about which areas are people trimming, which areas are people really cutting back, by and large, we've got these kind of arranged by proportion. The ones in pink on the right-hand side are the ones where there are more people saying they'll reduce it a lot than reduce it a little. So these are the areas where, really big chunks of population are looking to trim it back. And you notice entertainment and leisure outside the home is highlighted there as being, there's three that are all pretty similar, and they're all kind of at that kind of high tier, and entertainment and leisure is part of that. So cultural engagement is likely to fall into that category that people are really looking to reduce it a lot as opposed to a little. Unsurprisingly, the kinds of things people are more likely to try and trim as opposed to cut heavily it's the essential stuff. It's being able to get around, it's being able to pay your household bills, which I think people kind of know lots of those can't go down at the moment. It's shopping for essentials. The one that I think is interesting and worth highlighting though is entertainment and leisure within the home as opposed to entertainment and leisure outside the home, because there is a greater tendency to cut back the spending outside the home than within the home. Now that might be because there's more opportunity to make bigger savings, but it might be a sort of an indication that people are maybe more likely to cancel, you know, a theoretically planned theatre trips than they are cancel next for Netflix. So you've got a kind of, you know, a bit of a challenge there. And you know, we've always known that, you know, competing with the sofa is one of the key challenges in terms of cultural engagement. That's particularly pronounced now. And I guess the associated transport costs as well of going to outside the home is probably also a factor. Just to answer Gary's question in the chat, yes, we will share the presentation afterwards, so don't worry about scribbling down lots of percentages and things like that. So that's the big picture. Generally speaking, it's widespread, it's going to impact a lot. Discretionary spending, particularly around entertainment and leisure, is likely to be severely curtailed. However, people are not reacting to this in completely standard ways, and that's where it gets more interesting, at which point I hand over to Elise.
Thanks, Ollie. Yes, exactly. The picture is slightly more complicated, and to try to unpack that, we thought in today's tea break we'd show you a slightly different view of looking at these categories of spend and how people are saying they want to reduce them. So for this next section, we're going to be focusing quite a lot on the question that produced this chart on the right. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that we have grouped the population represented by our survey sample through this question, through which parts of their spending they are saying that they want to reduce. And we've done what's called a cluster analysis, just to explain briefly, which means that we are taking their responses and seeing where do the groups fall? What are people responding in a specific pattern more or less often? And we have found 6 groups essentially we can talk to you about, which, sorry, I'm not going to teach you the ABC. These are our 6 groups of, let's call them least concerned about the cost of living, current cost of living crisis, to most concerned. And essentially they fall in categories based on which category they decided to reduce a lot or a little. And so we have all the way on the left, category A is not looking to cut down on spending at all, or at least not in a significant way. Those are the ones who didn't say who didn't answer that question about which spend they were going to reduce. And then we have a category B. They said across the board, across all categories, they would reduce a little, mostly. And then category C, reduce most things a little, but household bills a lot. So they're kind of apart from the rest. They're the only ones who really mentioned household bills as like quite a prominent thing that they were worried about. Then we're moving to the more concerned categories of the population, and you have those who are reducing entertainment and leisure and going out. So shopping, food and drink, going out for stuff, and our entertainment and leisure category, which includes arts and culture, as well as other leisure stuff. And then we have a similar category, but slightly different. They're more focused on holidays, trips, and so on, but also reducing on the shopping, food outside of the home, food and drinks, treating themselves essentially a little less. And then finally, group F was reducing everything a lot. They're very hard pressed of those who across all categories will just reduce everything as much as they can, both essential and non-essential spends. So while we see that people are feeling worse off, they're worried in different ways. And that's going to play out in obviously what they choose to reduce, and it's going to play out, in their cultural engagement as well. Now it's interesting to think of these categories D and C. Obviously, one mentioning leisure outside the home, which is quite important to us, but also the other one with holidays and trips. might have an impact on cultural tourism. So that might be something to keep in mind as well. Yeah, then we thought to just quickly, this is how the percentage of the population falls into these groups, at least how it's modeled in our monitoring survey. So what we're seeing is the more hard-pressed groups are the ones with the higher percentages of people in them. So more people are feeling worse off and are more worried about more things. But also those least concerned groups are also quite high in their percentages. So essentially what that means is there's quite a lot of polarizing of the population in these behavior patterns. And not a lot of them are staying sort of middle of the road. So that's also something to keep in mind, and that will inform how these groups behave and the implications for the sector. If we take our 6 groups and look at who they are to get a better idea of who is being affected in those ways, in those 6 different behavior patterns that we've seen. Now, of course, we wanted to look at their audience spectrum segments. And what we're seeing, broadly speaking, is the least worried groups tend to skew towards higher middle engaged segments, and the more worried groups tend to skew towards middle to low engaged segments. So it's kind of what you would expect in terms of, because we're seeing a lot of correlation between levels of engagement and audience spectrum segment and socioeconomic situation. So, and not obviously that links to the cost of living crisis. So not too unsurprising. And it's worth also mentioning that some of these groups, we've done recently another piece of analysis that we called the sales change analysis, where we looked at the change in sales in organizations pre and post COVID, sort of seeing whether they're quote unquote back to normal. And we were seeing quite a lot of drop in attendance from some of those groups that are present here. So and that was, for example, home inherited and dormitory dependable. So this group B is quite present in that, and we'll mention that a little bit more in a moment. But for the moment, this is just how they spread across the segments. And in terms of who these people are, Group A, who are not cutting down, who are not worried about the cost of living crisis, they're both from the youngest age groups and the oldest age groups, so they have less of the middle-aged parts of the population. They tend to be more urban. They have quite a few retirees or people who are working but in quite senior roles, so they're quite affluent. There's a lot of disposable income, which makes sense if they're less worried about cost of living. This Group B, the ones who are reducing a little bit everywhere, a lot of the older age groups, who it tends to be these dormitory towns or more rural, which fits with other behavior patterns we've seen about from these same segments. And thank you, Ollie, for adding comments in the chat. Group C, who are reducing mainly bills, everything else a little, they tend to be younger. 2/3 of them are under 45. There's quite a lot from the youngest age groups as well. They tend to be young families, in employment. Quite a lot of them are working from home. That sort of thing, from more urban centres as well, London and cities in the northwest. And then from the more concerned groups, Group D, now we have families with slightly older children. They are modern professionals. They tend to be quite well off financially, but are decreasing their spend on leisure in general, in sort of middle-aged groups. And group E is a slightly older group of population. There's not a lot of families. They're feeling the squeeze financially, and saying that they're quite likely to reduce their leisure spend. And finally, group F, we're seeing quite a common demographic profile for those autism spectrum segments. So it kind of links those two together. There's a bit more rural. There are still quite a lot of families, especially with a lot of different age groups. A third of them have children under 16 of this group. There's a lot of manual jobs, service jobs, quite a lot of people with disabilities, especially reduced mobility or mental health related disabilities. And in terms of their interests, so this group A has a lot of this quite broad interest that over the whole population. Sports, traveling, and the outdoors tends to be the most popular interest cited. So they're quite middle of the line. B, our slightly older groups, are interested in history and heritage, unsurprisingly. And group C, our slightly younger group and more eclectic, are ranked quite high on arts and culture interests, creative hobbies, sports twice, sorry about that. Group D, the more mainstream, also like traveling and the outdoors, same as group E. And then group F, they had quite a lot of interests that other groups didn't have, such as gardening, cooking, creative hobbies. They were quite sort of community oriented, we'll say. This is kind of giving you a broad picture of who these people are. And maybe you're starting to think, okay, this kind of group sounds more like my kind of audience, or sounds like the kind of people I'm looking at, or I'm maybe worried about in my audience, or something like that. So we're going to look at how that translates into cultural attendance. But first, I also want to mention that COVID is not going away, of course. And in terms of COVID, these groups map out quite well in terms of those who are more worried about the possible crisis are also the most worried about COVID still, and about catching it, some of their friends or family catching it, the fact that we shouldn't just go back to normal straight away. And those who are less worried about the cost of living crisis are also a lot less worried about COVID. So that's another thing that's worth keeping in mind. And now if we're going to look at their cultural attendance for these 6 groups, we looked at what they tended to attend pre-pandemic. And we're seeing the group A, the more affluent, less worried group, tend to skew towards the high arts, sort of literature, classical, these sort of things. And this is just what they said they did in a typical year before the pandemic. And our group B was the highest for plays and drama, also ranking across performing arts quite high. And group C was highest engager overall. And for most art forms, they just ranked very high. They are the cultural engagers of these 6 groups, potentially on with group A, but actually more than group A. And it's interesting when we're thinking that it's quite a young group with a lot of young people, but also young families, young professionals. Group D, the ones reducing leisure and going out, they go to a lot of performing arts, but also museum and heritage sites. So it's interesting what it means in terms of them reducing that going out and reducing their attendance to performing arts. Similarly for group E, reducing holidays, they weren't very highly engaged before the pandemic, but what they did attend a lot was heritage and museums. So if they're reducing that, that's also that'll also probably have an impact. And then finally, group F are sort of more hard-pressed, community-oriented groups, they were interested in quite highly in outdoor arts, film, visiting historic parks quite a lot. So again, it's slightly in line with what we'd expect from those sort of audience background groups. And it might have an impact on those art forms if they are the most worried and most likely to reduce their spend out of everyone. And in terms of looking at their future intentions, we have that those least worried groups, especially group C, the ones reducing mainly bills, but everything else less likely to reduce. They were the highest engagers before the pandemic, during, and they are also the ones who say they will book ahead the most and have booked ahead for the next 2 months. And they're not expecting their attendance to change. And that's something we're seeing quite a lot across those higher, those least worried, the bluer groups. They're saying that they're expecting their attendance patterns to stay quite the same as they were before. So in terms of attending further or closer from home, or attending more or less than before. In contrast to that, especially group F, but all of our more worried groups, they tend to say that they're going to reduce their attendance and attend stuff more closely to their home. So that will also have an impact on visitation, depending on what these groups, what we know these groups do more or less. Yeah, so what this really means for us across the board in terms of the effect of the cost of living crisis on cultural engagement, is that there will be a lot of reductions probably, but it kind of depends who you are, and it depends where you are and what kind of audience you get. And really the slight, not good news, but the slightly less bad news of the whole lot is that there's a few groups that are, you know, even if they are hard pressed financially, they are deciding they would rather reduce other stuff than arts and culture just right now. And even if they're reducing their spend, they're still, you know, booking ahead, planning on attending stuff. But we do see some groups that we think might have some impact on the sector. For example, group B and D, where they have these groups, like we were saying earlier, that from the change analysis, we're seeing a reduction in volume of sales. And if we know that they're on top of that also being affected by the cost of living crisis, these factors might compound and create some more gaps in the audiences. But there are other groups that might step in, such as, for example, those younger groups in our category C. And so we might just see a shift in the makeup of the audiences rather than an overall reduction. And that, as always, it's a more complicated picture than just everyone is worried and everyone's gonna, sorry about them, and everyone's going to stop spending, basically. There's more variety in how people are choosing to do that, in which sectors in particular, and the effects on the sector overall. I'll hand back to Ollie, just transitioning to the next section.
Lovely. Oh, thank you very much, Elise. I would endorse the comment by Mary about this is so insightful. Thank you very much. For me, I think standing out from this, just a couple of key points. One is that the importance of arts and culture to particular audiences continues to be one of those kind of key dividing lines, of course, but it will kind of outweigh some other trends. But nonetheless, socio-demographic circumstances keeps recurring as being something which really has a big pull. The role and what happens to families has been a big theme as we've come out of COVID. We've talked about family groups being quite keen to engage and keen to come back. but we are seeing some relatively higher concentrations of families amongst the groups more hit by cost of living crisis. And bear in mind, this is before all the stuff that affected mortgage rates, which for a subset of families will be another kind of key factor, as well as other groups, of course. So in some ways, bits of this kind of cut across or interrelate with the whole COVID picture. So as Elise has flagged, there are some groups who may be disinclined to attend because of COVID, some because of cost of living, some because of both, and some few that escape both particular challenges. So it is, yeah, it is a complex picture, but with 40% of people in the two extreme groups, there's kind of quite a lot of polarization, albeit granularity in between. So I'm just going to pass over to Jacqui to give some reflections from other perspectives, and then we'll open it up for any questions, comments, or discussion from you. So, Jacqui.
Thanks, Ollie, and thanks, Elise, as well. I agree with the thoughts being expressed in the chat, but it's so interesting to see what's coming out of the CPM data, and has been all through the impacts of COVID as well. And I think echoing what Ollie was saying right at the start, actually, and in his summary just now, what really strikes me is that, first of all, I think it's really important to remember that people are not going to stop coming altogether. I think that's the really, that's if you can hang on to nothing else, that's something to focus on. And also the fact that we saw through the impacts of COVID just how important getting out of the house, the opportunities to get out of the house and do stuff, are so important to people, and particularly families, as Ollie was saying. But I think both with COVID and with the cost of living crisis, they have impacted, probably, they've impacted more on the people who have least resource to respond to them. But I think, there have always been people for whom cost is a barrier to doing stuff. And COVID and the cost of living crisis have exacerbated those, but they've always been with us. And I think one of the questions which is always really important to consider is the idea of value, because if people are making decisions about what they want to do, and they're becoming more cost conscious because of the cost of living crisis and the impacts it has on them, what they're looking for is something that represents for them good value for what they're for what they're having to put in. So I think that's something that everyone can focus on in terms of their messaging around the offer that you have, making sure it's really clear what's on offer, that there aren't any hidden costs. Again, thinking about local audiences, which we have been, since in the post-pandemic world. We have seen that those patterns of attending have become more localized. People aren't traveling as far, and that this research actually very strongly reflects what I've seen in the Visit Britain sentiment tracker as well, in terms of the high proportions of people who are concerned about the cost of living rise, and also the impacts it's going to have on how far they're travelling and whether they're deciding to go for days out or short breaks or longer holidays and things like that. So I think these are all things to consider. I was really interested to see as well that the National Gallery have done something which in my memory, they've never done before, which is for their latest Lucy and Freud exhibition on Friday evenings after 5:30. They've opened it up, the tickets, to pay what you will. They are open until 9 p.m. on Friday, so it's not that you just get sort of 20 minutes to look around. And I think that's really interesting, because that's something that's most likely to appeal to people who are living and working in London, so their local audiences, and also might attract people who are coming to stay for the weekend and happen to be there on the Friday afternoon. So it'd be really interesting, I think, to see how these new strategies might support maintaining the relationships with audiences through offering them added value where you can, And as I say, just being really clear about what the costs might be for them, because they'll be factoring in all the additional costs of travel and food and drink and things like that while they're out. I think that's my thoughts on what's coming out of all of this.
Well, thanks very much, Jacqui. Yeah, I think that is an interesting example, because it does suggest that the kind of price discounting is looking to reach a really quite broad part of the population. It's not just kind of looking at the hardest pressed, but recognizing actually that everyone is pressed, or at least almost everyone, as we've seen.